Welcome to HarmonyTALK, a podcast about dreamers and doers. Hear people from all walks of life tell us about their dreams and the moment they knew there was no turning back as they went from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. My name is Greg Frigoletto, your host for this episode. For today's episode of HarmonyTALK, we are honored to have a conversation with Akea Brionne. Akea is an interdisciplinary researcher and artist working at the intersection of lens and fiber-based media. Her practice explores the relationship between colonial and imperialist history and their impact on identity politics, cultural storytelling, memory, and assimilation. Her work analyzes this primarily through the observation within the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on Creole culture. Akea, welcome to HarmonyTALK.
Wow, thank you for having me.
It is absolutely our pleasure, and as I was reading through that intro, it's very complex, your work, and I can't wait to dig into some of that in just a minute. And I'm super excited to speak with you today, and it's not only because I am fascinated by your story and your work, but just as much because I want to learn more about your artistic expression and the art forms that you use. And your work, as I just mentioned, it is complex and it's rooted in history and culture. And I want to get to that in just a bit. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners that this is a podcast that looks to inspire by sharing stories like your story that demonstrate that dreams can become a reality, even when there might be great obstacles to overcome. In other words, dreamers become doers. So as we sit here today, the good news is it's safe to say that you're accomplished. Your artwork is personal and it's multifaceted. In fact, it's highly regarded, it's award-winning, and it's been exhibited all over the country. However, not that long ago, and in your case, truly not that long ago, you were just a little girl, perhaps a little girl with a dream, and then a dreamer that went down a path. And I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about that part of your journey, how it began.
I feel like anytime I think about this question, I always come back to this moment of, I had to be about 5. So I was in kindergarten and I had won an award at the local fire station for drawing a picture. And it was about fire safety. And so it's just a picture of me and my family outside of the house with tears. And it was a really interesting sort of introduction looking back. It was a really sad project to do, to sort of build on fire safety. But it was sort of the first time that I had realized that you could actually be awarded, or at least have some sort of acknowledgement and excitement around something that you could create. And so I think that really started for me as the beginning of thinking about creativity and visual exploration as a way to connect with other people. And from there on, I just knew that I wanted to pursue art full time. So it sounds pretty wild to say, but I mean, at 5, that was really when I decided this is what I want to do. And I've been going ever since then.
I mean, 5 is an early age to know already, and it's something as pivotal as that project obviously headed you down a path. You talked about that particular project being something that was sad, and you obviously, in your artwork for that project, you expressed something that you've kind of described as sadness. Do you remember, and possibly you do, what you were trying to even express as a 5-year-old through that particular piece of artwork? And do you still have that artwork?
I don't have the artwork, but my mom has it. She's held on to it ever since, but that particular picture, it sort of felt for me like I was just trying to express the urgency of getting out of this space. So that was the prompt. That was what we were supposed to do, is sort of communicate distress and, just to think about fire safety at that point. And so thinking back, I think I was just trying to communicate the message that I was told I needed to communicate. And that's what I did. So we're just standing outside of the house. There's just little flames coming out of a few of the photos. It doesn't actually look as sad as I'm making it sound, but I think the prompt was very interesting as something that was very exciting for me.
So from that point, you had success, you won the contest and you kind of knew what it like to be able to express yourself and have artwork be something that could be rewarding, even personally. From there, you launched into that path. Did you never look back? Was there ever a time when you had other thoughts, or was artwork and art as a pathway from that point truly the only path that you really went down?
Yeah, I would say there were obviously other things that came up, but I didn't find myself interested in them enough. I think I was around 8 or so when I decided I wanted to specifically pursue fashion design. So my mom got me a sewing machine and I started taking sewing classes at the local senior center. So I was the youngest in the class by a good 70 years, but it was great also being able to spend so much time with so many elders and learn just skills in terms of constructing garments and making patterns and learning about thread and taking care of a machine and oiling it and cleaning it out and going to pick out fabric. And these are all interesting things to think about now that Joann's Fabrics is closing. So that's also been an interesting thing where for me, I've actually had this really emotional and sort of intense relationship with learning that news. And it sort of brought me back to the foundation of when I started to explore art making more seriously, especially textiles and fibers. And so that was sort of what I wanted to pursue. But I started to understand that the culture of the fashion community, it just wasn't something I had the interest in being a part of. And so I started to feel that might not be for me. But I didn't really resonate with most mediums that artists are known for, specifically drawing or painting. And that's pretty much the extent of what most secondary and primary schools focus on in their art education. And so I started taking more seriously pursuing a career in STEM. I was either going to pursue psychology or chemical research. So my best academics at the time was chemistry. I just loved it, but I am the type of person where if I don't have that intense burning passion for something, I don't give it 150%. And it honestly gets more of like a 60% for me. I still do good, but I don't push myself to excel in the ways that I do when there's something that I'm excited about. I started to realize very quickly that if I'm going to be looking down at my life and this is a career path that I'm not completely obsessed with, I'm just not going to do well either in the job or I won't mentally be doing well. And I think as someone also who had a single mom who worked literally all the time, I saw how unhappiness in your job and in your career, the thing that you're spending all of your time in, I saw how that changed her as a person. It changed her as a parent. It changed her as an individual. And so I think very early on, I also started to connect the relationship between happiness and the thing that you spend all of your time doing, whether it's called a career, a hobby, passion, job, whatever you want to refer to it as. It's what we're spending the majority of our time doing.
I think there's a lot of value in what you're saying there in loving what you do. And I think truthfully, as a lot of young people are exploring what their options might be or what the job market looks like, there's too frequently not enough emphasis placed on what do I love to do? The passion piece that you just talked about and finding joy in what you do. And it's kind of an interesting thing that you brought up, your mom and as a single mom. And, I'm sure there is a level of appreciation for what she did, because as a single mom, she probably worked hard and provided and supported you and maybe even guided you to go down the path to do the things you love. But at the same time, it was hard probably for her. And now that's part of your story now, and there's a lesson there that you learned just through the way she offered and provided. And you talked a little bit as you were going through all of that about the different types of art forms that you are immersed in. And you mentioned, your experience with Joanne's fabrics and how maybe that sort of textile art is inspired by some of those experiences. But you're also into other types of art forms along with textiles. You're into images and film. And I think a lot of the artwork that you've done in the past deals with landscapes. And as a guy that admires and loves art, but I have no history at creating art, I wish I did. And maybe there's still hope, maybe, but maybe you can put us into your creative headspace. I don't know what it's like to have that passion and to be an artist and to know where those inspirations come from. Can you maybe share with us a little bit as an accomplished artist where inspirations come from for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that everyday life is an inspiration for me. I think everything that I do is sort of responding to the things I'm seeing, the people I'm meeting, the places I'm going, the food I'm eating. I think that for me, growing up, I did feel very unstable, though, in my environment, which led me to feel very unstable in terms of how I saw myself. And so, I'm originally from New Orleans, and around the time that I was 8, Katrina hit. And so that was a huge destabilizer for obviously for anyone involved. But I was 8 years old at the time and also trying to make sense. I didn't really have a concept of what was happening in terms of the ripple effects. And so, sort of navigating through that and moving around, eventually moving to Maryland, where that town that I grew up in started experiencing historic flooding, Ellicott City, Maryland. And it's an old colonial town built on a river. And so, with a lot of the climate changes that have been happening, it's destabilizing the ground and the soil. And then when I was 17, I moved to Northern California in Napa and started experiencing wildfires and earthquakes. And so, thinking about all this happening during one's formative years when you're actually starting to not just create a concept of yourself, but also the world, it made me sort of rely on looking and observing because that's all I could do. I was sort of moving from place to place and sort of transient and just watching a lot of destruction happening, not just environmentally, but financially, emotionally, physically, just all of those different aspects. And so the camera, which I sort of came to when I was 15, my grandfather gave me his old 35 millimeter camera. That was what he had when he was in his 20s. And so he gave that to me. And so at that time, it was so exciting. It was an outlet where I was like, wow, okay, I can actually explore the things that I'm going through in a creative way, but with a tool that actually engages me. Film and the darkroom, all of that is just chemistry. And so I was also able to sort of be scientific and be a little tinkerer, but in a way that was visually pleasing at the same time. And so it was this interesting transition where it was like, wow, okay, great. Sort of therapy in a way. I can use this to sort of process the things that I'm going through. And it just so happened to be through pictures.
I actually spent time prior to today viewing your film, Mississippi Goddam, which, by the way, I thought was beautiful. And much like all of the other art forms and pieces of art that you've done, I found it to be extremely personal. And my hunch from looking at your artwork and from watching that film is that you're a person that is a wonderful observer. You have a tremendous curiosity. And I think that you really do a wonderful job in making history and where history was as part of your artwork, also having that be some point of having us be able to know where we're going. And when I watched that film, I was mesmerized by it, actually, not because, our backgrounds are necessarily the same, but more because there were certain themes that I thought you accomplished in that film that crossed cultural lines and divides. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But if you could first, if we could maybe talk about that film, tell us about the inspiration behind the making of that film.
Yeah, so the film Mississippi Goddam is titled from a song. It came out in the 70s, and yeah, it was something I was thinking about when I was beginning this project, which was actually tied to a project that I did that I was commissioned for by the Mississippi Museum of Art and the Baltimore Museum of Art. And they asked me and other artists to ruminate on the Great Migration, which is the sort of mass exodus of African Americans from the South to the North and to the Midwest and various other areas. So, a lot of stories are often centered on the migration north, but my family actually migrated west. My mom was born and raised in Los Alamos, and she grew up in Albuquerque in New Mexico, which is a really interesting space that's riddled with just a lot of histories that also don't necessarily reflect African Americans. And so when a lot of people think of the Southwest, and a lot of people think of New Mexico in particular, it's sort of a vast space. Much of the space is unoccupied. It is one of the poorest states in the country, in addition to Louisiana and Mississippi, where my family is also from. And so the project sort of starts with my grandfather's migration. So I was sort of retracing his footsteps when he was born and raised in Columbus, Mississippi, which is a northeastern rural town. I was a small factory town in the country of Mississippi. It's about 9 miles from the state line of Alabama. And so I'm sort of retracing his footsteps from Mississippi, his migration to Louisiana, where he met my grandmother, and ultimately their migration onwards to New Mexico. So we're sort of starting at the house that he was born and raised in, which his grandfather bought and built, or he bought the land and built the home after he was freed from slavery. So my great grandmother, my dad's mom, she was the youngest of 10 siblings, and she ultimately inherited that house. And that's what my grandfather and his brother were raised in. And I'm inheriting that house now. And so the film is sort of exploring that process of going back to that space with my grandfather, thinking about all of the aspects of his life and his migration that ultimately resulted in my ability to navigate in my own life, both through education and just different experiences. So we're sort of walking through that house together, and he's sort of telling me about what that space was. But the town has sort of fallen into disrepair, and a lot of people are moving back to the South, but they're not moving to small rural towns. And so we're sort of processing that as well.
As I watched the film and after hearing you go through all of what you just said there were certain things that resonated with me. Some of the things that you said, for example, the difference between a lived experience and hearing about one, and you also made reference to looking back at some of the photos that you encountered through this project. And in those archives, everything seems so beautiful. Pictures of family from the past, and they were happy, and the imagery was beautiful. As I said, kind of segueing into the discussion of the film, there are, I think, great parallels between, your history and my history, or anybody's history, when we're looking at the past. And you said in the film that, you hopefully find part of you in the wreckage as you were going through that film. And maybe you can share with us what you believe your history or anybody's history means in regard to identifying who they are and maybe where they're going.
I think knowing the past is so important, but I think even more so knowing your own past is such a valuable tool. And I think that part of what we are struggling with, I think particularly in American society, is a disconnect with both individual histories, but also sort of the global perspective. And so I think for me, it was really important to realize, wow, I don't have any siblings. I'm my mom's only child, and she is my grandfather's only child. And at that point, when I had started the film, I didn't have any children. And so I started thinking, this is my last opportunity to actually get a firsthand account of what life was like for a different generation, for my grandfather. I realized I don't have that much time left. And I also don't have anyone else once, he's gone, my grandmother's gone, and my mom is gone. That's sort of the end of the line of my family for me. And so I started to take time much more seriously, and I started to realize, wait, this is my family. I don't I don't have anyone else. And so it became also sort of maybe like an honoring of them and trying to make sure that I could capture as much of who they were so that I could also have an understanding once I don't have them of like grounding for myself. So it was a really exciting project to do, but it was also incredibly emotional. You sort of referenced the quote that I have at the end there of there being a difference between a lived experience and hearing about one. And so that was something I've also thought about a lot, especially with what we're going through and sort of seeing a lot of shifts happen culturally and socially and politically. And wherever you stand on that side, I think we all are sort of feeling sometimes that buzz. And for me, I think that I started realizing outside of my research and outside of learning about the past, my grandfather had a really tactile experience with the past, and how he navigates and thinks about the world is completely different than how I navigate and think about the world. And so for me, it's been a really interesting exercise in intergenerational and multi-generational sort of knowledge sharing and storytelling and sort of cross examination of the human experience.
You had mentioned your grandfather, and just a little point I'd like to make about my own story is maybe, several years back, one of my grandparents, my grandmother, passed away. And at her funeral, I have an uncle who spoke at the funeral, and he gave a little eulogy, and he challenged the younger generation, which at the time included me and some of my younger cousins, to know and embrace the responsibility we have to keep the family dynamic going, because what he had already started to see is some of what I think you're alluding to, that, the differences between how you view the world and how your grandfather views the world is somewhat of a generational thing, and people are more readily going in different directions, which is causing small or big families to be more distant just in miles from each other. And I think that generational difference is creating a different dynamic with the spirit of family. And I think that's some of what I recognized in your film, that your family seemed to be more together just by location and over time spread in different directions, which I think is somewhat systemic and almost epidemic at this point for a lot of people. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that I loved about those photos was that sort of not even just the feeling, but just the actual visual of communion and fellowship with one another and actually seeing community. I think now, especially as sort of a younger millennial, I sort of feel like there's a lot of conversations about community, but there's not actually a lot of consistent engagement in community. I think we're sort of living separate lives, and I think technology and social media is sort of fueling that. And, I don't want to get into a whole critique of it, but it is something to think about if like looking at those images and seeing they didn't have anything to do but talk to each other. They didn't have anything to do but tend to the land and engage with one another with music and storytelling and going outside and eating together. And I think for me, that was a really sort of sad realization as well, but also thinking about like a lot of infrastructures collapsing and a lot of people having to leave. They needed to make livelihoods. And so I think about also my great grandmother, who was the youngest of 10 siblings, and all of the boys, six of them, moved up to the north. And yeah, it broke the family and they didn't really come back. A lot of people through generations, they've never actually been to where their grandparents are from or their parents are from. And I think it's definitely something to reflect on.
I would agree it is. And like you, I value what I see in my family's history, and I value a family dynamic. And I think for a lot of people, it has to be something that as they move forward in their lives, they need to consider with intention so that there is a purpose behind actions that they could take to kind of maintain some of those, I think, really important assets, if you will. Now, kind of moving forward from that to something that is really quite an honor. The Forbes 30 Under 30 is an incredible honor that you received, I believe it was in 2024. And for those that don't know what that is, the Forbes 30 Under 30 is an annual list published by Forbes magazine that recognizes and celebrates young people under 30 who are making a significant impact in various fields. And in your case, it's the art world. And in this list, it highlights individuals who are considered to be innovative and influential, potential future leaders in their respective industries. It's huge. That's an incredible honor and accomplishment. So for you, when you heard that that was something coming your way, was that important to you?
I would say yes and no. I was always sort of unsure of how the process happened. And so I think years ago, I had had it in like a vision journal, where I sort of visualized goals. And I think that the Forbes 30 Under 30 was one of those. But I mean, this had to be almost 10 years ago. And I hadn't really thought about it too deeply. So when I got the email that I had been nominated, which it's an anonymous nomination, so you're not sure of who's nominated you. And so it is sort of a realization of, right, okay, there are people watching and paying attention to what I'm doing, even when it doesn't feel like it. And so when I did months later find out that I had been chosen, and I found out with everyone else when it went public, it was a huge validation in terms of thinking about the fact that anything that you decide you want is it's actually possible to attain. But it was also very validating in the fact that I didn't make a mistake pursuing an artistic career and actually showing people that you can make a sustainable path for yourself.
With any, I guess, artistic industry, whether it be music or art forms like you produce and create, I would imagine it's challenging, and not everybody can have accolades like, Forbes, 30 Under 30. Was there something to be said with this accomplishment that maybe provided to you confidence, kind of like you've already said that, you've made the right decision, but also confidence knowing that your future is bright?
Yeah, I mean, I've always known that my future was bright. I think that you have to believe that if you actually want it to become true and be real. So I think I've actually always existed in to others what might seem as to be a space of delusion, but to me it's just faith and just knowing like it's gonna work out. As long as I decide to do it and move forward, it's going to work out. So I think it was confidence and affirmation in the sense that work yields rewards.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations. I think you well deserved. And again, congratulations on that. And after an honor like the Forbes 30 Under 30, something recently happened for you that probably, humbles everyone that goes through it, parenthood, and now that you're a parent, how is that going to impact and inspire your work moving forward?
Oh my goodness. I feel like the most radical and impressive and awe-inspiring thing that you can create is another person. And so I think that for me, sort of, I feel like I've already achieved everything. I feel like just experiencing my son and being able to just watch him develop into a person and actually get re-grounded in what life actually is, it's the best thing. So I feel like for me, it's just sort of cemented the fact that creating and imagining and realizing things is so incredibly possible. I just feel like, there's so many things I want to do and I'm just getting started. And really the only challenge now is figuring out how to be as present as possible with this little human and be as present as I can with myself.
As a parent myself, I have two daughters. It's the most wonderful thing my wife and I have ever done, but at times the most challenging. And there's a great balance that, you'll have to discover, I'm sure, with your being a parent and being an artist. As I was, learning about the arrival of your son, I did kind of reflect back a little bit on the movie, your film, Mississippi Goddamn, and, the premise behind it. And it was such a heavy theme of family. I mean, it might even be more profound now that you're a parent than it was even when you were creating it. But you might even, have an expanded outlook on that wonderful premise of that film. So if we could, to close, as an accomplished artist, what would you want to tell aspiring artists who are still in the dreaming phase of their path?
I think the biggest thing that I would share, which sounds like a cliche, but though I'll be honest that as I get older, gain more experience, and accomplish more, the cliches are actually so real. I think the biggest thing to remember is that you just have to do it. I think that sometimes we can allow ourselves to get wrapped up in fear and anxiety. And I'm also not saying this to minimize the very real fact that there are different challenges for different people, whether that's time, money, resources, a network, confidence. These are all resources that some have more of and some have less of. But I think ultimately the only thing that has ever stopped me was myself. And so actually rooting yourself in your own power and the potential of your dreams being reality, I think it's just important to use it as motivation and to remember, like, you just have to do the work. Just show up every single day, and it's impossible for you to fail.
Do it. I love it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate those words of wisdom. And Akea, I want to thank you for sharing some of your story with us and widening our appreciation of the significance of art. And on behalf of all of us at Harmony Talk, thank you for inspiring and for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Greg.
It's been our pleasure. I've been talking with award-winning artist Akea Brionne. You can learn more about Akea by checking out her website at akeabrionne.com. You can also find Akea on her socials at Akea Brionne. This has been Harmony Talk by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm Greg Frigoletto. Thank you again to Akea for being with us today. To our listeners, continue to dream and keep doing.